I had a new experience this year on vacation that I never ever had before. I got stung by a jellyfish. Anybody get stung by a jellyfish? Those are like you never want to have, but at least now I can say, check that one off. Hopefully that'll never happen again. But it's fun when we think about vacations. There's usually experiences we want to have happen, and there are other times there's experiences that we didn't anticipate. I remember one vacation, actually it was a getaway that Anita and I were doing, and we would have different levels of vacation and getaways depending on time, money, and availability. And this one particular getaway was down in Indianapolis to a hotel, and we have a few rules, and that was when our means were limited. Before we could afford a hotel room with a jacuzzi room, so we'd always look for an indoor pool. Had a hot tub in the pool area, and so we're hanging out in the pool area, and there was a gentleman that was there. And I was aware of him because he was sitting next to me in the pool and talking. He used colorful language. Now, he's talking about the primary colors and the tertiary colors and the different ways that the Crayola crayon box was. He used some very interesting words, normally that are not used on Sunday morning in this spot. And he also had a cooler. Now, we're not talking a lunch cooler. I'm talking a 48-quart cooler. And by observing him for a while, had to be at least 2 cases of beer. Not that there's anything wrong with that, just observing him. And so I'm aware that social convention would say, as people talk, you share what they share. And you kind of go back and forth in like a ping pong or a volleyball match. You kind of like, I'll give you a little information, then I'll match that information. And then I'll give you, and we'll match that. And so that was happening. But there were certain parts of my life, particularly my vocation, that I figured he may not want to know. Not because I'm ashamed of it, I'm okay with it, but based on his conversation, our conversation, observation of his behavior, it might make him uncomfortable. So I dodged that question for a while. He would talk about, hey, why are you here? Well, we're here to do the vacation and just kind of get away. And he's doing what many of you may do, the weekend warriors where you're off for band or soccer or whatever, and you're camping out at a hotel. And that's why they were there, was for band. And they were just kind of camping out that evening after a long day, watching their kids march around all over the place. And so we were talking. Then he talked about what he did, and I did not talk about what I do. And I could tell he was starting to get frustrated. But I'm going, sir, you really don't want me to say what I do. So I kept dodging it. And then after about 20 minutes, he looks at me square in the eye and he goes, so what do you do for a living? Okay, you asked. Well, sir, I'm a pastor. To which he said a couple of swear words. To which he said a couple of more swear words because he said those swear words. To which he said a couple of more swear words because he said those swear words because he said the swear words. And then he realized, wait a minute, I have something behind me. To which then he started moving like this. Now he's in the pool and he's crawling up over the pool, pushing everything away. Now, I'd sat there for 30 minutes. I did not sit in judgment. I didn't say anything. I'm just getting a chance to know the guy. I'm on vacation, wanting to relax. And he was very bothered by what I did for a living, which is why I worked very hard not to tell him. And I want to say, sir, I'm sorry you asked. And I wasn't going to tell you. But what I am aware of, sometimes by the nature of what I do, sometimes the mantle and the role in the office of pastor makes people behave weirdly and oddly. I'm grateful that doesn't happen in this church, but I've seen that over the years. Actually, I'm a PK. Now that means my dad was a pastor, so I'm a preacher's kid. Now actually, I like to refer to myself as a TO, theologian's offspring. It sounds like it has a little bit more class. So I'm very aware, that's the household I grew up in. So I grew up knowing that people will treat the pastor and pastor spouse and kids differently, simply by the nature of what the dad or the mom does for a living. I've had that experience. That's what I grew up with. And I played 3 sports. And I remember one particular time in high school, I was coming into the locker room. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a locker room. Locker room can be a little interesting, dicey, a little spicy, if you will, in the language and the stories that are told. This particular day, there was a very good dirty joke being told. I know that because I walked in on it, and I heard a little bit of that. Now, I enjoy good humor, and so I heard this joke. It was being told very well. It was being set up in a very great manner, and as I walked in, whoever was telling the story turned and saw me, to which they said, "Stop, don't tell the joke. He won't want to hear it." Now, I can still remember my very first thought that came to my mind. Yeah, I do. I not only want to hear it, I'll probably retell that joke because it was a good joke and he was telling it well and I never got the punchline. But what I've learned is sometimes people change their behaviors simply because of what people may do. And I grew up as a PK, and it never really affected me. I was able to just enjoy life and to do that, and I never really felt the effects of it. Some of that might be my temperament and the way I engaged in life. My boys, however, grew up PKs as well. And as we have heard them now that they're adult, young men, and we begin to hear their stories, and it's affected them much more differently than it affected me. And I wish I could tell you that they're actively involved in a local church, but they're not. And the reason they're not, as we begin to hear and continue to be in conversation with them, is because of the way some church people have treated them by the nature of what their dad did for a living. And so I'm very aware that sometimes people can be and act in certain ways. I know some of you are coming back into church after having bad things happen in local congregations. We've lived that, and it's hard when that's your job and you still have to stay engaged with people who don't always act in kind ways. One of the things that Caleb reminded us last week is it's common to treat people poorly. It's common to speak badly. It's common to act in certain ways. And yet what we do know, and one of the things Caleb mentioned last week, an uncommon life is an intentional life. An uncommon life is different than just doing what everybody else is doing. It's easy to live the common life, but God has called us to live an uncommon life. I do ask that you would pray for our boys. We continue to pray that God would bring people around them that would speak to their heart to be able to minister to them where they are, just as we're continuing to come around other people's kids and other people who have had those challenging experiences. But I think sometimes we in the church many times get it wrong. And we want to look at that a little bit today. So I invite you to grab your journal and grab your Bible as we continue in our journey through Ephesians. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Gabrielle talked about the different roles of apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, or shepherd, and teacher. And many times we relegate those to the clergy or the pastor or church staff. And she said, no, all of those roles are all in the fullness of the people of God, all part of the church. And the reason is to equip God's people to do his work and build up the church, the body of Christ. So that's why that role is there. Yes, there are people that are in the role of official pastor or church staff, and that's our role to come alongside and equip. But each of those roles are there to equip and for the maturity and the building up, to bring unity in our faith and knowledge in God's Son so that we will be mature in the Lord. That's the purpose of those roles. So it's not just relegated to a handful of people. But then we also see, instead we will speak the truth in love, growing in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of the body. So we were able to understand from a couple of weeks ago that we each have these gifts to live out our faith. And as Caleb reminded us last week, anybody can do the common stuff, but we're called to live uncommon lives. But what I find is sometimes people go, well, I don't want to live that life, because they don't want to have the experience I've had growing up. They don't want to be treated differently. You don't want to go to work and go, ooh, we need to stay away from him or her. I get that. That's been my life. And I understand when people say, I don't know that I want to be a Jesus person, and I don't want to behave differently. I get that. So what does it mean to live an uncommon life? And so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to walk through what does it mean to live an uncommon life. And we're going to look at it some very practical ways over the next couple of weeks. And so we can see today, as we jump into Ephesians 5, we can walk toward an uncommon life by living in love. And now one of the powerful things in living in love is to be able to imitate God. Just simply imitate God. And I love how he puts it. This is pretty simple. Watch what God does and then do it. That's pretty simple. Now, we get it in such a way that we are able to understand it like children who learn proper behavior from their parents. And so when we are able to understand that we're just like growing up, the way that kids learn how to do stuff. How do you sweep a room? How do you shave your face? How do you do woodworking? Or how do you change the oil in the car? How do you change a tire in a car? The only way they learn is to watch how they do it. And so imitate God. Watch what God does, then do it. Now, we realize that can be kind of a challenge. Well, God's kind of big. So how do we do that? And so part of that is there are ways to unpack that within the body of a local congregation to help make it a little bit more practical. And so we see that happen in verse 2. Live love-filled lives. So the New Living Translation says, live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, a pleasing aroma to God. So that goes back to the Old Testament sacrificial system. In the Old Testament sacrificial system, when a sacrifice was made, an animal was killed and put on the altar, it was burned, and a pleasing aroma of the burnt sacrifice would rise to heaven. So that's exactly what they're saying is when we live a life filled, that it's a pleasing aroma to God. But it's a sacrifice. It's not easy. It takes dying and doing that. And I also believe that when we put hamburgers, brats, and hot dogs on the grill, that there's a reason that that's a spiritual experience. It harkens back to the pleasing aroma to God. So you just that it reminds us, God, I just placed myself. We can have those spiritual moments of the cookout and the grill. But we see in the Eugene Peterson's translation, the Message says it a little differently. He says, mostly what God does is love you. That's what God does. That's who God is. That's God's personality. Keep company with him and learn a life of love. Just hang out with God. Spend time with God is really what he's saying. Observe how Christ loved us. His love was not cautious, but extravagant. He didn't love in order to get something from us, but to give everything of himself to us and love like that. And so we're beginning to see what that love is and how that begins to unpack. And it's extravagant. Most of us live stingy lives because we're barely holding it together and we're trying to keep as much as we can. So to give extravagantly is really hard. I know some teachers and some school personnel in various levels of caring for the kids. There are days that it's like, you're on my last nerve last week, and it's not even barely there, and you're holding it together and how to give love. I get that. You're holding it together. We do that in our work environments and in our normal daily lives, and it's hard to live extravagantly when we're barely holding it together. Or we can hold it together at work, but we have just had a knockdown, drag-out fight with our spouse. And as we drive to work, we don't know whether we're going to be married at the end of the day. We don't know whether or not this was the last one. And we go into an environment. Some of our students have heard that fight of mom and dad. And they go to school and they're trying to go, be engaged, learn something today. And all day they could wonder or not whether both parents will be home when they get there. We don't always know what that's like. And so it's hard to live an extravagant life. It's hard not to live cautious because there's a lot of hard stuff happening in our world. And yet that's what God calls it. It's an uncommon life. Actually, Gary Chapman in his book, The 5 Love Languages, gives us some tools to understand pragmatically, practically what love looks like. I've had the chance to share this with some premarital couples as we've done premarital counseling, but also with other couples as they're going through that. And he identifies 5 basic languages of love. We all have them. We all have a primary language. We have a secondary language. And there's one language that doesn't even come up to our radar. Actually, it is actually, if that love language is spoken to us, it actually pushes us away. And so there are dialects and there are different ways to do that. And most of us are very fluent with our love language, and we're not fluent with the people around us, whether or not it's our spouse, our children, or the people we work with. And so just to give you an idea what that looks like, words of affirmation. There are people that their love tank is filled when we speak words of affirmation and affirm them. We are so glad you were born. I love the fact that you're here. You bring so much into that. I just love you. Not for what they do, but words of affirmation for who they are. Being words, words of affirmation. That stirs people's heart. Another one is spending quality time, giving the other person your undivided attention, leaving your cell phones back when you take a walk, being able to look each other and have conversation, being able to just spend time together. Now, the challenging thing is that we also have to understand how we're wired. Men have 10 to 15,000 words. And depending on our job, we might use most of them during the day. Ladies have 25 to 35,000 words. There's a broad span there. Some have fewer, some have more, but they definitely have at least 10 to 15,000 more than the average male. What can happen is when the wife has quality time as her primary love language, and she goes, at the end of the day, honey, would you take a walk with me? She's going to ask me to use words. I've used all my words. I don't have any more words, and she's going to expect me to use words. So sometimes it's negotiating. I will spend quality time with you if I don't have to use a lot of words, because I don't have them anymore. But if you want to use all your words, I'll walk with you and let you use all your words. And so you spend quality time letting those words just pour and pour and pour and pour and pour, and you're like, oh. The other thing that's important to ask is, do you want me to fix it, or do you just want me to listen? Very important question. I used to fix stuff, and Anita just wanted me to listen. That helps a lot. And so you spend quality time. The other one is that to receive gifts, and that's buying gifts, a well-thought-out gift. Now, what's wild is this can work. Some of these things can work in different ways, even if it's not their love language. So my wife's love language, I learned later, is spending quality time. But because I learned how to be a husband by watching my dad give gifts, I would buy a lot of gifts. And one day, I bought Anita a 44-ounce thing of lemonade. And so when I came home, I said, hey, I was at the marathon station, thought of you, and I gave this to you. And she looked at me and she goes, you were at the gas station and thought of me? Really? I said, no, you don't understand. No, I was at the gas station and I was going back to the bathroom. She goes, you're really not doing any better. I said, no, just hang on. So I went to the bathroom. That's not where I thought of you. And I came back out, and at the drink section, they had fresh lemonade. I remember she loves fresh lemonade. I got you 44 ounces. I didn't get you the small. I got you the super size. And then I came up and they had fresh white chocolate macadamia cookies under the counter. I remember you love chocolate macadamia cookies, and I bought you those. So I went to the gas station not thinking of you today, but because I was there, I saw two things that you loved. I bought them for you, and now I'm bringing them home for you. She goes, that's different. That's not even her love language. But I learned how to tell what was going on in my brain. Sometimes we don't do that really well. I've gotten myself into trouble at times. But a well thought out gift, not for me, but for them. The other thing is perform acts of service. We see that those are those actions that speak louder than the words. I go to work, I provide a living, I clean the house, I do the laundry. You should know I love you. And so those are those things that mean a lot. Or you've made my lunch for me. You've even put a little bow and cut my sandwich into a little heart. And honey, I love that. But the guys at work, can you just not cut my sandwich into a heart anymore? But those acts of service that really speak to somebody's heart. And then, of course, physical touch. And everybody's like, all the ladies are like, well, yeah, I knew that was going to be there. Not that kind of touch. But we're talking about appropriate deep touch. That's that thing, that may be that hug, it may be that kiss on the forehead, it may be the hand holding while you're driving down the road, that meaningful touch that just is that physical connection. I just need physical connection. The challenge is each of us speaks one of these fluently, and it's usually ours. Rarely are we married to the person with the same love language. And so the challenge is we need to be considering others in our life and loving them, here's the key, the way they want and need to be loved. And that's part of living that uncommon life. In the pragmatics of home, of school, our neighborhood, our families. And so we begin to go, how does that work? Now, you teachers understand that because each of your kids are designed differently, and some of those kids you have to teach differently because they're wired differently and they respond differently. Our kids at home, they respond differently. Our spouses. And so we begin to go, what is that? And we begin to reach out. That's one of the reasons our most recent outreach event that we just did yesterday was a simple act of painting fire hydrants. You say, well, that's not very churchy. Exactly. It's designed not to be churchy. It's designed to love God, love neighbor, and love Fort Wayne. And so part of our partnership with NeighborLink is to go, how can we love God and love our neighbor in very practical ways? You say, well, why would we paint a fire hydrant? Well, what they found is, one, that rust is there, and if you put fresh paint, you can now see a fire hydrant that is blending in, and so if you put fresh paint, now those of you that have houses with a fire hydrant with rust, it looks ugly. But others, if you put it now fresh coat of paint, their yard looks much better. Their addition, their cul-de-sac looks much better. So why would we do that? Because we're not going, you need to come to our building and speak the way that we think you should speak. We go, we're going to go to your neighborhood, help your neighborhood be a better place. And then we're going to engage in conversation. We're going to start where you are. And to love God and love neighbor in meaningful ways that are meaningful to the neighbor, make their neighborhood a better place. And then after a while, they might engage in conversation. Oh, you're from Sunrise. A number of people said, why are you doing this? Oh, we love God. We love Fort Wayne. We love your neighborhood. We're just trying to be a good neighbor. And, well, you don't live here. No, we don't live here. But this is our neighborhood. We actually did the Sunrise Southwest Campus neighborhood. Just simple ways to practically love. Now, most of the time, we in the church have been known for a certain way of communication. And so here's a short video that I think best describes how the church has been known for communicating about our faith.
Let's go, Catherine. I'm going to say two words to you right now. I want you to listen to them very, very carefully. Then I want you to take them out of the office with you and incorporate them into your life.
Well, shall I write them down?
Well, if it makes you comfortable, it's just two words. We find most people can remember them.
Okay.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay, you're there. Stop it!
I'm sorry?
Stop it!
Stop it?
Yes, S-T-O-P, new word, I-T.
So, what are you saying?
You know, it's funny. I say two simple words, and I cannot tell you the amount of people who say exactly the same thing you're saying. I mean, this is not Yiddish, Catherine. This is English. Stop it.
So, I should just stop it.
There you go.
I think many times we in the church, and we've earned it, is when we see people's behavior, we go, stop it! And all they hear is anger, and they experience an angry God and angry people of faith. But I love how Paul begins to unpack Jesus' words into a community. And we've got to remember when we read Paul, not only today, but over the next couple of weeks, Paul's stress on moral purity was a standard which the ordinary heathen, the ordinary citizen, had never dreamed of. So when the Christian community said, there is marriage between a man and a woman in a monogamous committed relationship, that was not the normal. It was not normal for bosses to be able to care in a meaningful way for his and that culture's employee. And actually, in that culture, they called them slaves and masters. The slave in that context is more of an indentured servant. It was not common for parents to, particularly dads, to love their children because children and women were seen as property. It was not common for the Christian message to raise up the value of sexuality in a different way than the way the culture was explaining and displaying it. The way relationships were being done. So over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at how Paul's stress on some of those things were very countercultural, revolutionary, if you will. But we read them with a North American, middle class, often mindset. And we wonder why Paul was saying that. Well, there's a context. We got to see him in context. And so we're able to understand that the rest of our verses are helping us to understand how to walk that out in love, but also how to walk out the uncommon life. And basically, don't use good things for bad. It says, don't allow love to turn into lust. The common person can allow anything to drive them, and allow all their biological urges to drive them. That's common. That's easy. It takes no thought. So don't allow love to turn into lust, setting off a downhill slide into sexual promiscuity, filthy practices, and bullying, greed. Though some tongues just love the taste of gossip, and last week Caleb talked about how it's common to speak in gossip and slander. It's common to do those things. But those who follow Jesus have better use for their language. There's an uncommon way that we talk. Don't talk dirty or silly. That kind of talk doesn't fit our style. Thanksgiving is our dialect. You can be sure that using people or religion or things that just for what we can get out of them, the usual variations on idolatry, will get you nowhere, and certainly nowhere near the kingdom of Christ, the kingdom of God. It's easy to use religious things, even religious practices, and the things of God and people around us for our benefit. That's common. And Paul was saying we are called to live an uncommon life. Don't use good things for bad. And then we begin to shift. That's how to live love. But part of that living in love is also walking toward an uncommon life by walking in light. And so what does that mean to live that life in life? One is don't be fooled. Don't let yourselves get taken in by religious smooth talk. So not only the religious leaders, but also other forms of religion that don't get caught by their smooth talk, get furious with people who are full of religious sales talk, but want nothing to do with them. So be mindful, and that brings us not only be fooled, but live as people of the light. And so he begins to unpack this. He goes, you used to live a certain way. Now, I grew up in the church. I never had a hell to heaven experience. There are times I wish I would have had a hell to heaven experience. It would have been a lot more exciting than to tell the story I have. But then I realized that's the story we want our kids to have. We don't want them to have to go look for life from things that make them die and almost die, and to do horrible things and do things that they were never intended to do or to be, and then to come back and go, and I got saved. No, we'll get you saved and help you live fully into your destiny who God called you to be. But in this culture and in our culture, we've got people who were trying to live a life and they're making some changes. And so that's what he's talking about. You groped your way through that murk once, but no longer. You're out in the open now. The bright light of Christ makes your way plain. So no more stumbling around. Get on with it. The good, the right, the true. These are the actions appropriate. Daylight hours. Now, I'll confess, when I was a teenager, there were times I wanted the dark. A lot more fun things can happen in the dark. What I discovered as a parent, I was saying things like were told to me. Nothing good happens at nighttime. Nothing good happens after 11 o'clock at night. Why do you need to stay out all night? You don't need to do that. Because the dark hides stuff, but the light exposes stuff. And so what are those things? And we're called to be people of the light, of daylight. And so we live that life, but we do that as we carefully imitate Christ. Because it's common to want to do those base things. It's uncommon to live as people of the light. And so how do we do that? Carefully imitate Christ. Figure out what will please Christ and then do it. It's pretty simple. Now, that was being taught back then, and in the way we do our faith development process, that we're helping people figure that out and grow in their faith. And then do it. Don't waste your time on useless work, mere busy work, the barren pursuits of darkness. Expose these things. Now, that's a key piece. We're going to come back to that. For the sham they are. It's a scandal when people waste their lives on things they must do in darkness when no one will see. Rip the cover off frauds and see how attractive they look in the light of Christ. Wake up from your sleep. Climb out of your coffins. Christ will show you the light. So many times we point at the bad things people do by pointing at the people who are doing the bad things. And we go, stop it. You're bad. But we're called not to point to people, we're called to point to things. And we're called to love people. See, many times we look at people who are doing things and they're doing things that may not be the best things for them. But what I've learned a while back is people will look for life from things that make them die. People are just trying to make sense of life, and they may not have the tools, they may not have the upbringing, and they're just trying to figure life out, and they may not know some of the things that we have figured out. And people do stuff out of bad choices and out of pain. And so how do we start loving the person and engaging them where they are? And then the behaviors will fall away, but they're only trying to do the best they can. So if we focus on loving the person and engaging them where they are, eventually we'll have an opportunity to talk, maybe, if we earn their trust, about behaviors. But we learn to live in light and imitate Christ. How did Christ? He always met people where they were and encouraged their being. The woman caught in adultery, he didn't say, "You're a bad person." He began engaging in conversation. Let me know your story. Let's build a relationship here. He didn't start with, "Stop it." He started with, "Tell me your story." Being a good neighbor. Just being a friend. Being able to seek to understand where they are. Because once we understand their story, their behavior many times make a lot of sense. And those times that I've engaged in those conversations, it's like, man, I'm surprised you're not more screwed up than you are. And I'm so sorry. How can I help you be there? How can we help you be better? And so carefully imitate Christ. Carefully imitate Christ. And then to be wise. We can walk toward an uncommon life by being wise. Living carefully. We're dealing with people's lives. Just like the church can hurt my kids who grew up in it. I know some of you have stories about how the church has hurt you. And so I take very seriously that you're giving the church a second chance or a third chance. And so we try to live very carefully with lives. And we do that, so watch your step, use your head, make the most of every chance you get. These are desperate times. Don't live carelessly and unthinkingly. Make sure you understand what the Master wants. And the Master wants that none would be lost, that all would be saved. But we don't start with "you're bad." You may be doing bad behavior, but you're great. You're a child of the King. You just don't know it yet. You're redeemable, but you have not been told that ever in your life. And so we start to seek to understand and meet them where they are and to offer the love and the hope of Christ. And so how do we do that? So we are filled with godly things. And I love it. Don't drink too much wine, that cheapens your life. Drink the Spirit of God in huge drafts of Him. So many times we'll go to McDonald's or other stores and we'll get the super gulp, big size thing of pop. But we want the senior serving of Scripture. And I love what Paul says. No. Drink huge drafts of God, big gulps. Be filled with those things of God. Sing hymns. Now you're going like, I'm not going to sing a song. I'm not going to work going, "Oh, for 1,000 tongues." Please don't, because you'll look stupid doing that. I don't do that, and it would be expected of me if I were to do it. So don't do that. That's not what it's talking about. It's talking about what are those things that reinforce your faith. The hymnody of the early days were songs. Now we have radio stations and playlists that help reinforce our faith. And so what are those things that reinforce our faith? Sing songs of the heart, sing praises over everything, any excuse for a song of God the Father in the name of the Master. So what are those things? Put those things in your mind that reinforce. So many times we will mindlessly watch Netflix and anything. We'll have the remote, 150 channels. What are you doing? Nothing, literally, except pushing a button, watching flashes of nothing. Nothing good on. They can't even make good shows anymore. They're bringing back old shows from 20 years ago in new ways. They're not even doing them as good as they did back then. But see, the thing that we need to be mindful of when we watch shows, when we listen to music, we need to be mindful that some of the motives of those who put together those things don't always have our best interest in mind. And so you be wise. We've got to be aware. We've got to fill our minds with certain things. There's some studies called the power of vicarious experience. And what we find is we will learn. There's actually been studies done in a 2/3 world country where they were trying to change people's behavior. They wrote a soap opera, and they had the different people, and they had this drunk truck driving husband that was abusive to his wife and his children. And then over the course of that, people could begin to vicariously learn, oh, if I behave that way, that's how my wife experiences that. And they begin to change a country's behavior by vicarious experience. And it began to change that. They did part of the country and they learned that their behavior changed. They did another part of the country and their behavior didn't change because they didn't do that. They added that soap opera into it and their behavior changed. In 1970, Norman Lear began to change how we thought about the human reproductive rights. And one show, Maude, began to talk about an older woman that was wrestling with whether or not she should abort her child. And they did studies before and afterwards and found that by watching vicariously her go through that, changed the way we thought of a very sensitive subject. And so whatever we listen to, whatever we watch, we just need to be mindful of the power of vicarious experience because it does change the way we think and the way that we behave. And so we do need to be mindful of those things that we put into our mind because an uncommon life is an intentional life. And to be able to focus on those things. And so many times we focus on stop it, and yet God is a God of do it. To see what God does and to live out who God's called us to be. To experience life to its fullest. So 3 questions I want to invite you to ponder. So this week, what is one way you can live in love? What is one way you can live in love this week? Just one simple way to love somebody else in a way that is meaningful to them. One way you can share the light of Jesus this week. You don't have to be odd, you just have to bring light. If you bring a little candle and put it in a dark room, it dispels darkness. You just need to be the light of Christ to people who may never, ever read the Bible or go to church. But you and I get the chance to be light. And then one way I can add wisdom. What's some way that I can be mindful of what's going on so that I can add the wisdom of godliness into my life and to be able to focus on that? Let us pray. God, we thank you for your care and your love, and we ask that you would be with us. Help me to be mindful of the many ways that you move. Be mindful of those things that I do. So I give you myself. I give you my week. Help me to be mindful. Help me to be intentional to live that uncommon life. We thank you. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, thanks for watching the Sunrise Church YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this message, take a minute and hit the subscribe button on your screen. That way you won't miss a single message. If you'd like more information about Sunrise or become a partner in our ministry, send a quick message to prayer@sunrisechurch.info. Thanks again, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button.